I can see it.
Everybody got it? I haven't got mine, but it doesn't
Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is the second EATG webinar on the review of governance. You know who I am. I'm Jackie Morton. I'm the chair of the European AIDS Treatment Group. The purpose of this webinar is really to update members on the process and the progress of the work that we've been doing on the governance review, and to outline the proposed next steps. And there's going to be 3 presenters on this webinar, myself from the Board of Directors and Kuhn as the Executive Director, and Caroline Oliver, who is our independent consultant. Tamas is our administrator and will guide you through the webinar procedure, and any questions you wish to make will be collected by Tamas. And all the webinar slides and follow-up to the contents of the webinar will be available to EATG members on their members list. If you have any questions you'd like to make, could you please ask them at the end of the presentations? Okay, thank you. So if you go to slide 2, and that talks about what I'm going to talk about, which is, just to summarise, the theory of change that we adopted as a model, what the governance process is about, what management is, the process to date, some of the core documents that we looked at, and some of the future process. Okay, could you go to slide 3, please, Tamas, which looks at the theory of change? Boxes. Okay.
Yes, it's on.
I can't see it because I haven't got it on mine, so I'm just going through my slides.
It's on now.
Thank you. Thank you to Ian Hodgson, who introduced us to the theory of change models. But what we wanted to do within the process was to be very clear where we wanted to see the model to be delivered at, and we were rather hoping that we could have delivered a bit more than we have anticipated at this General Assembly. So if there are any key decisions we need to make on the theory of change and the model that we've adopted, we'll be really making it, that's particularly on the constitutional changes that would be presented now at the General Assembly in 2018. So if you look at our desired change and what we want to see happen, somebody's got a baby in the door talking in this. EATG has a governance model that clarifies the level of authority to make decisions by 2018 GA. So that's our long-term goal. And then you work backwards from these to identify all the conditions, the outcomes, the other goals that enable us to deliver on that model. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see in the centre we wanted by January 2018 to really have revisited the documents that are shared with the membership for approval through an extra call to GA members. And we're working on those documents at the moment. Caroline's doing that work. And so by November 2017, EATG has reviewed those documents with the DMAG group. And by February 2017, we were looking at developing the steering group that helps to support and advise on this process. So the right-hand side is all what we were doing as a process with internally as a group. And then on the left-hand side of the model, it's how we're going to communicate with members to make sure that members were involved in the process. And you can see coming from the bottom up, this is our second webinar. We had a webinar in May, and then by January we had the membership survey that gathered members' opinions, and then at the last year we presented the review of governance model that Brian Teixeira and Marie and Kuhn and I started to look at before the General Assembly last year. So that's where we're starting to look at our goals. And I just wanted to give a quick overview as to why we were doing it, really, in a sense, just to refresh your memories as to what we were trying to achieve. So that's the next slide, please, Tamas. And we did a survey in November with Caroline in January that looked at our current governance processes, and there was a number of concerns that came out about where decisions are being made and how people are accountable to those decisions. And we also looked at the increasing workload and demand on the EATG at the time. As you all know, the world is changing on HIV and its co-conditions, and so we've moved into hepatitis and TB and long-term conditions, but also economically the world's changing for HIV in the terms of there's less money being provided for HIV services. And we wanted to make the best use of our existing resources. So part of that was clarifying decision-making within the EATG and allowing decision-making to be at the best level so that people could get on with the work without any delay. And we know in the past that there has been some concern raised from members actually when the decisions were being made and who had the authority to make those decisions. So the next slide looks at what governing is, and as a board, you know, I came into the board 2 years ago and we wanted to make sure that we as a board revisited the model because of it was 2014 when we looked at the constitution, when the last constitutional changes were properly made, and as a board it was really about making sure that we were in the right place with the right decisions at the right level of the organisation, and we know that that wasn't how it should be. So looking at the slides, you can see that we wanted to make sure that that it's about being accountable to our members, that we are being transparent around some of our decisions, that we make sure that we follow the rule of the law, and our law is based in the German law, and that we are responsive, effective, efficient, and that we participate with everybody, because we've been criticised that we're not being very open and transparent and participative with some of our decisions. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Thomas, which is slide 5, just to clarify what governing is about. It's about agreeing the purpose of the organisation, why are we all doing what we want to do as an organisation, making sure we have the broad strategies to carry out its purpose effectively, making sure that we have a process for implementing and making decisions, being accountable for that performance, operating within our law, our German law, and being accountable to those who have a stake in the organisation, which is our members, who Caroline will expand upon in her presentation. Next slide, please, Thomas. Just to remind you about management, and
I think the slides are one ahead of you, Jackie. I think we're at process to date. Yes.
All right, if you go back to management, please, because I haven't got the slides in front of me. Would you mind, Thomas, going back to management slide?
We're there now.
Okay, good. Management, if we look at management within EATG, it's implementing the strategies that were agreed by the General Assembly and by the board, and making sure we have the detailed planning in place, the workforce plan, procedures to deliver on that workforce plan, looking at delivery on the strategic outcomes, and making effective utilisation of resources such as our financial, our staff, our capital, and dealing with the staff management issues, coordinating the efforts of any volunteers, how we use our funds, and really making sure that everything is directed and controlled in the operational level of the organisation. That's different to governance in the terms of how the board oversees the governance of EATG. Next slide, please, Thomas. So I'd just like to outline what we've done to date, and you will see by this slide, in October of 2016, we, as a board, thought we needed to have somebody independent just to guide us through this process, who's an expert in board management, board governance models. and Caroline came to our rescue and is there as our independent advisor and supporter and guide. We did the surveys, which I've talked about, and we had a governance meeting in November 2016 where members met with Caroline and went through some of the issues and concerns, and we decided thereafter to do a follow-up membership survey just to get the views of members, which clarified some of the key issues that we needed to address. You can see we set up a governance steering group, and initially it was through members of specific groups. So we chose members from the working group chairs, from internal auditors, through the board, and then we expanded that to through a call to members to have 2 members join us who were from the membership. And we've had a number of governance steering group meetings, as you can see. We've had teleconference calls mainly on those dates that are outlined there. So there's a considerable amount of hours gone into the calls that we've had as a group, and we've largely been looking at the documents that we have within EATG, particularly the Constitution, and Koen will expand on that when he talks about the Constitution. In March and May, we did the planning of the webinar, and we had the webinar, and then June to August, we looked at reviewing documentation, Constitution. This is our 2nd webinar, and after this webinar, the governance report will be circulated to the General Assembly. Just to remind you some of the key documents that are essential for us to look at within the EATG, and that is the Constitution, which is set in German law, and that Constitution outlines our key strategic aims, but also some of our key governing aspects of EATG, and it is the members' documents. It's owned by the members, so that is, Caroline will expand on that. Also, we've looked at the board's direction and control and how the board looks at the governance of the organisation, and then there'll be the EATG's staff operation guidelines that looks at how these policies are implemented. Next slide, please. Process planned. The board will report to members for the General Assembly on the 24th of August, which we've pulled together. It's in draft and that will go out after this webinar. We've got the webinar today, and we will do a presentation also at the General Assembly. We have a session planned in the General Assembly. The next steps, really, Caroline will really go into more detail, but she is working on the operating guidelines. We hope to have those available October, November. We're also looking at the translation of the Constitution, and Koen will expand on this, and we'll circulate documentation to members, hopefully in January, for approval. And the last slide is really just to thank members who have put a lot of effort into this last year. It's been a little bit behind what we planned, but we set ourselves a huge challenge to enable us to deliver on this governance model, and we've worked extremely hard to get where we've got, and we didn't want to rush through anything. We wanted to make sure we did a full and thorough review and had plenty of opportunities so that members could get involved in the process. So I would like to finish by saying thank you for your listening to my presentation, and I'd now like to hand over to Koen as he will talk through some of the work we undertook on the review of the Constitution and the impact on this review. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, Tamas, you may go to the next one immediately. The next slide, yeah. So as Jackie already mentioned, we had a look at some point with the group at the Constitution, because we thought if we are planning to do some changes related to the governance within EATG, what impact would this have on the constitution, which of course has been drafted from a really membership-driven organization with not all the levels we have now in our daily work. So we spent, I think, 2 TCs at looking on the constitution to see what changes would we like to make, what should be reflected where. And as you can see on this slide, the exercise was actually very interesting because it made us think very carefully about how we interpret certain things, how we interpret also the proposed governance changes. But looking at the end to the whole constitutional process we've made, we kind of realized that no changes are actually mandatory in order to implement most of what we have been thinking about to do within the content of governance, because the German legislation, the German constitution does allow actually quite a lot of things, as it includes things like delegation, setting up groups. So I just want to show a few examples of things we highlighted within the mainly English version of the Constitution and the kind of discussions we had for you to understand where this is going to. Next slide. So we had actually not that many, but a few of real mistakes where, for example, in the previous version, in the English one, it said IST instead of it, so that's more of a visual thing which we can easily change, but we don't need a constitutional change to do so. Next one. We had quite some discussions about working groups. At the moment, we see that the position of the working groups in general is being questioned a bit within the organization. We're not sure how useful they still are as a group because of the fact that we work more and more transversal. Most of the projects we have, they do include policy elements, scientific elements, capacity building elements. So one of the discussions we had here was who actually sets up the working groups. Do all working groups need to be set up by the GA, or can other more practical implementational working groups be set up at different levels? And one of the things that came out is that certain working groups should be really established by the GA, and they include groups that could look like DMAC, for example, groups that work on really membership-related issues or constitutional ones. And so we thought at some point to really highlight in the Constitution when the groups were GA established. At the end, we also realized there that the GA anyway is able to set up or to dismantle working groups. So is it needed to specify it here in the Constitution, or should we just further clarify what kind of working groups we have, who sets them up, mainly in the terms of reference that we have. We had a discussion about the terminology used now for what was previously the handbook. Now it's the operating guidelines. We used to talk in the past about protocols. We now said that this is now the terms of reference, because that's how we call all the different chapters of the operating guidelines. Also there, we didn't know if it was really that crucial to change it now, as it is not really making any basic change to the protocols as they are actually called mainly in the German version. Next slide. We had some discussions about, for example, here, the financial reports. In the original constitution, it says that draft financial reports should be sent 4 weeks in advance with the invitation, and then the final one should be sent at least 1 week. Whereas now, as we change the timing of the General Assembly from spring to autumn, we actually do have the full financial reports ready by the time the invitation goes out, because they have been reviewed by the external auditors. Budgets are included immediately, the draft budgets for the changes of the current year, the proposed budget for next year, they're sent with the invitation. So actually we didn't see any need anymore to split these things. At the same time, the basis is already in the constitution, so it even allows us doing more. So also here we felt there is no specific need to make a constitutional change, because what we want to do is better or more than what is already in the original one, in the one we have now. So also here we decided to keep it as it is, and if at some point we want to make changes, this could be then an example where we want to clarify more what the actual practice is. Next slide. So in this one, we had a discussion about who is actually representing really the association when there is a legal court case. Is it the group? Is it the chair? How do we interpret the extrajudicial part here? So in this paragraph, we also again felt that more clarification is actually needed on how to interpret it, rather than a real need of change of the constitution. We need to clarify the roles. We need to clarify when the board acts as a group, but also what is then the real legal responsibility of, especially in this case, I think the chair, but even for the other directors, I think the legal framework needs to be clarified. Next slide. We had a few parts where we decided to remove, for example, part of the sentence. So in this case, where we said instead of the appropriate member of the board, it is the board, because we felt that the board should be acting as a group and not as one individual in certain contexts. Next slide. In this paragraph, which speaks about freelance work, so we added the words "to the rules approved by the General Assembly," which is just actually clarifying more like it is the GA that approves the rules. Next slide. This is I included this one to show actually the impact of this GA working group thing, because that chapter D that is talking about setting up working groups would then be completely transformed into GA working groups that help the GA with its work, and it would reflect the split between working groups that are actually set up by the BOD, which could be something like what we now have, the External Advisory Board group, or other groups that support the work of the BOD, or even smaller committees that I would set up when a certain project is approved. But as I mentioned before, we actually felt that at this point, no constitutional change is needed to start establishing this system if it's approved by the GA, because the GA in any case already has the power to set up groups or not, or to delegate certain tasks to different levels. Next slide. We had some discussion about the selection of chairs and who does it. Where the original version says the working group elects one of its members, elects within its members one or more co-chairs, where we then felt, well, maybe we should say it is within the membership that it selects, because that's what's happening now. The working group selects within their own members a chair, and that chair is then ratified by the GA. But even there, the current context does allow this to happen. We had a change of way we deal with the chair selection, so which is already implemented. The next slide, I think this is almost the last one I wanted to show. Working group decides with a simple majority of votes, so the working group members present. Abstentions are not to be counted. Here we just removed also a spelling mistake where it said D to with D a simple majority, so we removed the word D. Next slide. Changes are mainly about interpretation of paragraphs, especially from German language, and change of words in our current vocabulary is our conclusion. We really want to clarify in our current English terminology, what do we refer to? And Jackie presented before as well the key documents. At this moment, our previous handbook is called Operating Guidelines. We have operating guidelines that are there for the membership. In 2013, we also decided at the GA that some delegation part towards the ED and other delegation parts towards the financial manager should be taken out when we voted, because they felt this is really the responsibility of the board of directors. So in a certain way, at that time, 4 years ago, some things were already initiated by the GA that are now being more developed and implemented. And so we are dealing with documents with different names. We are talking about terms of reference. We are talking now about working groups that have their own committees set up temporarily or not. There are some groups that are very directly set up by the GA. So what we have been doing is actually implementing more practical systems to perform the work. But when we check the constitution, nothing of what is happening now, as far as we could see, does need either a change or is even against the current constitution. It is about interpretation on how to do, and there we felt that, and that's the next slide, that we will need to, no, the next one already, we will need to do some proper translation checks, because throughout the years, as you might know, what we vote at a GA is an English text because that's what people understand. At the same time, the German version is the only legal one. And what we realized throughout the years is that sometimes the translations might not have been correct in both sides, either from a German originally created one to the English one or the other way around. And so what we need to do is really do a proper translation again, then see if we need to make amendments, and if at the end maybe we do need a constitutional change. But if that happens, that will be something to be presented at the GA in 2018. And as mentioned, we don't feel any barrier at this moment to implement parts of the governance process that we have been presenting to you last time as well, if it is approved by the members. Because the framework of our constitution does allow delegation from the GA to the board, from the board to an ED, from the ED to other staff members, and it's all a matter of proper reporting, proper management, and redirecting the other way around, that people at least see what has been done and what hasn't been done in the correct way and within the spirit of the General Assembly. So the next steps will be that we will do the translation, we will review again in further clarification of the process what constitutional changes might be needed or not, and present as appropriate to the next GA possible changes. I think that's my last slide. Yes. So,
yeah.
Yeah, so if there's any questions on this part, or do I first refer to Caroline to finalize?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Koen. Thank you, Jackie. And hello, everyone. And very, very good of you to be here and participate in this build up to the GA, which I'm hoping will do more to further understanding of what this whole process is about. As Jackie said, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about some of the broad principles of governance, just from my experience of working with many different sorts of organizations over the years. And I'm not, I'm going to just sort of fill out a bit more of what Jackie was talking about in terms of governance and management, etc. Every single organization that is constituted in it as an entity in its own right is basically a chain of accountability. The accountability of the staff to the ED, the accountability of the ED to the board, the accountability of the board to the membership, and obviously the accountability of the membership to society at large through law. So in every separately, individually constituted organization, there is that chain of accountability. Now, in order for that to work effectively, it is very important for everybody who is involved in that chain to be clear what their role is in that chain. Now, the complicating factor with a membership organization is that as members, you are often playing really multiple roles. So members of EATG, everybody's a member, but some of you will also be sitting on the board. Some of you will also be sitting in or serving on working groups, which may be accountable to the board, may be accountable to the membership, may be through the GA, may be accountable to the ED. Some of you will be performing staff roles, be it albeit on a volunteer basis or on a paid basis. So you are all wearing, most of you will be wearing several hats. Now the problem is that life gets extremely complicated if you don't know what hat you're supposed to be wearing and you don't play those hats to the full when you're supposed to be wearing them. Because that either means that hat, the role that should be being played under that hat isn't getting played at all, or it's muddled, and nobody knows who does what, and we get into we become very ineffective. And obviously you can see this sort of thing at work, taking a really graphic example of the role clarity, the need for role clarity in the course of an operation in a hospital, if you didn't have real role clarity between the different players in that operating theatre, the outcome that you would want for the patient is most unlikely to come out, and accountability would be impossible. But because we know, everybody knows what their role is, and some of them, again, maybe sometimes they play different roles in according to whatever the procedure is that they're doing of the day. But whenever they're playing that particular role, they're absolutely clear what their role is, and they therefore can be held fully accountable for that role. So as a membership organization, everything starts with the membership. The Constitution is the founding document. Without the Constitution, you do not exist as a separate entity. And that document is fully owned by the members, cannot be changed unless by agreement of the members. The only people who can shut the organization down, other than the German government, which is the only body that would supersede you, are the members. So everything starts and finishes with the members in their role as members. And I think that's you know, a very, very important piece to realize. Now, so you could talk about the members as being equivalent to, say, you know, shareholders in a corporation, in lots of not-for-profit organizations. The people to the ultimate accountability actually rests with the board, but then the board will often, and I would always encourage this, create a sort of virtual membership to be accountable to, so that they aren't just adrift. But the role of the board is to be that membership or ownership one step down, not management one step up. In other words, the role of the board is to interpret the best interests of the members within the terms of the Constitution. So the Constitution is written within the terms of the German law, and the board's work is all a further interpretation of the best interests of the owners or the members as set out in the Constitution, and then the board delegates to the CEO or the ED in your case, who then again is authorized to make a reasonable interpretation of what the board has said. But you obviously need reporting at each level, continual reporting against the standards that are set so the members need reporting against what's set out in the Constitution from the board. The board needs reporting from the ED in terms of what they've set out for her or him. And so forth. So when it comes to creating the next level of documentation, Kuhn has taken you through some of the points of the Constitution. We're going to be looking at the level of documentation, which is the level that is not member owned in the same way that the Constitution is, but is the board's sort of interpretation of their work within whatever the Constitution says. And as such, that documentation is going to go into 4 areas that will, and obviously we'll be drawing on all the stuff that you already have under these headings, but hopefully maybe sort of tightening some of it up, clarifying some of it, and I'll just like to make a little note about terminology in a moment. But we will be so one section of the board's documentation will be their further interpretation of what the EATG exists to produce, using a reasonable interpretation of what's said in the Constitution. Another will be about the risk boundaries that they wish to set around the ED's room for manoeuvre. Excuse me. Another section will be about the board process, so how the board runs itself. And the last one will be about delegation to the ED and the accountability of the ED. And then just on terms, one of the things that we have come across as we've gone through is that we have this sort of twin, this is very, very common, we have this twin desire. One is that we want to stick with language that people already know and are comfortable with and not have change for change's sake. On the other hand, we also have this desire that where the current language could make somebody think that what they've got is exactly what they had before, if exactly the same term is used, then sometimes that can be, dangerous or misleading, and one actually wants positively sees the advantage beginning to slide over into actually maybe changing the terminology is a good thing. But we're going to be erring on the side always of trying not to change terminology that people already know and are comfortable with, and we will just sort of do our best with that. And obviously we'll be coming to and fro with the with the working group that we have on this, which is has some very well attended meetings, which is good to see, and coming back to the GA, etc. So I think I'll stop there and allow time now for discussion and questions of any part of what you've heard today to Jackie, Kuhn, or myself.
If you would like to say something, then you raise your hand, I can unmute you, or you just type in a question and I can share the question. I know that Jackie has to restart her computer, so she's not online for the moment. She is online, actually. Are you here, Jackie? Because I can see you here.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Faint, very faint.
Very faint, am I? I'm having a bit of problem with my computer. I think the internet's gone down. Isn't it typical? I just wanted to expand a little bit on what Caroline was and Kuhn was saying. One of the things we talked about around where we look at our operating guidelines in terms of reference, we wanted to make sure that we involved our current processes and systems in that review. So looking at DMAG as a membership advisory group. And Ferenc, who is obviously the co-chair, was hoping to be involved in this webinar tonight, but unfortunately he's travelling back in Berlin, so it couldn't be available. But one of the things we were talking about is really looking at what the next steps are in the terms of how we start to look more transversely around our working groups and how our working groups are structured. And Caroline will be working with Ferenc just to look at making sure that anything to do with membership and members' roles are involved in the process around the discussions of future steps. But what would be really interesting from our perspective is to get members' views on the working groups as they currently exist, because there has been comments given to us that the membership of the working groups are too large now that they are not classed as working groups anymore, that the working groups are now working much more transversely across projects or themes that portfolios that EATG has, and starting to think about what the structure for the organisation to work with the ED needs to be. to enable us to achieve on what we're trying to achieve within the strategy, but also looking for the future strategy, because obviously we need to start revisiting the strategy from 2018.
Jackie, can you move a little closer to the microphone, because we're losing you.
Sorry, I'll turn it up. Is that better?
Yes, it is better. Thank you.
And so really some of my preamble there is to help members to think about what do we need for the future to enable us to deliver on the future strategy for EATG in the terms of how we currently are structured. And I know that members have had ideas about this, and one of the things we'd really like to hear is if people have any thoughts, processes of what the organisation should consider to help support Kuhn as Executive Director. Caroline is working on the board policies of what we need to do as a board, but the next steps beneath that will be what does Kuhn need to help him as Executive Director to deliver on all that we're trying to achieve. So that was just a preamble to say where we're looking at for this next year. Any questions? If we have any constitutional changes, like Kuhn said, at the moment, we believe that the German version of the Constitution allows us a great deal of flexibility, and what we don't really want to do is change the German version. But we can change what's in the English version, provided the meaning is the same as what's in the German version. And so therefore it gives us quite a bit of flexibility in language, provided we keep the meaning. And so some of the things that we have to changes, and we present it. We will be presenting that at the GA in 2018. Any questions?
If you have any questions, then please click on the raise your hand button, and then I can unmute you, or I can just unmute blanket everyone if you think that's useful.
I think it is maybe useful, no?
Okay, I can do that. No problem. Everyone's unmuted now.
Or just any observations would also be welcome.
Hello, it's Gus here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Gus.
Okay. I think EATG got very stuck with the working groups model because it's a communication issue, particularly when it comes to ECAB, but also to a lesser extent with policy. The working groups are sort of pinned around meetings, regular meetings, and they're the chance for people to meet each other and communicate with each other. By the way, I'm in favour of the working groups setting changes, because I've always been one of the people saying, look, things like prevention are a cross-cutting issue. We need to have cross-cutting task forces. But I can see the reason why people are very attached to the working groups model. It's because that's the way they meet each other within the EATG and talk to each other. So you need a replacement for that. You need a replacement for the regular big ECABs and things like that if you're going to do something different. I think that's really my sort of reflection on it. So I think that the difficulty in changing has been in the fact that sort of EATG's sort of cohesiveness was pinned around these working groups. And we need something that, we need a model or a framework of operating that needs to feel just as cohesive.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree with what you say, Gus, and one of the things you mentioned now, for example, was ECAP, and what I felt in the past communications I had for the past 2 years is that even the fact that we call our third pillar ECAP, whereas ECAP is actually only a part of the scientific work we do, creates already a big confusion, and especially last year also we felt that even ECAP as a group we should look at how we can modernize it a bit, because we need also more community consultation and input on policy levels, which is now not really structured. It's only done in a scientific context, in the way ECAP has been working. And indeed, I think that the working groups have facilitated in the past meeting, although I think it was less for some groups like policy. At the same time, we feel now that this meeting without any real scope is also a barrier. So we need to indeed find a way to optimize the communication and the interaction with the members, bring out more of the funds and the opportunities we have, and see how we can make things more transversal, more inclusive to the different areas where we want to look at. And I think it is one of the priorities personally of what we need to look at, because it has to do also with people's individual motivation, feeling that they are indeed part of something, and it will make our activities, I think, more efficient. So for me, this is really a priority. I don't know if we have a ready-made answer at this moment. I don't think so. But we should definitely do the effort to go through that process.
Brian here, if I could. For me, I was glad to hear several things. I really like Jackie's slide about governance and the distinction between that and management. I'm really happy to see we're talking about 2018 and not 2017, because it would make things really difficult. I really appreciate Carolyn's mention of membership organization and how complex that is, because for me, and I think this might relate somewhat to what Gus is saying, is how do you keep that culture going that has a lot of membership engagement, but still have really clear roles and accountability? And I know that's not easy, but I'm glad to see that's on the table, and the idea of minimizing any kind of terminology change. So there were lots of things that were talked about that I really liked. On the last point we're talking about, I mean, at my most radical kind of moment, I mean, what it seems to me is that, you know, we want transversal projects, in quotation marks, where we've got all the three elements, the three pillars, or whatever we're going to call them. But we still want the possibility that members could get together to just discuss a policy matter or a science matter. But maybe those also should be built into the projects. You know, within a project, you might want some time to reflect just on a particular policy or just on a particular science element. But if members were linked to projects via reference groups for the various projects, that's one way that we can maximize or validate whatever membership engagement, even as the working groups sort of become less functional. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but basically saying work to focus on projects and get members involved with the projects through membership groups, reference groups, and then allow for specific one-off kinds of policy events that might be specific to a particular project. I'll shut up now.
No, but Brian, I think what you say is indeed one of the problems we're facing. I heard quite some people saying in the past year, like, what's the purpose of meeting just for the meeting, the sake of meeting with a working group? Isn't it better to meet more targeted in indeed what you say, in a project-based way, in a, as we call it now, portfolio way? Doesn't it make more sense to bring certain people together that really work on something, rather than to bring a whole group together to just discuss things you might or might not do, and then not even have the funds anymore afterwards to really do what you want to do? So if I understand you well, that's indeed what we are discussing at the moment. Isn't there a way to become more efficient in the kind of meeting we do, and go more in a thematic project-based or other way, and bring the experts together when we need to have them together within our membership.
I really like that idea as well. I'll just pose a challenge, really. As you know, I'm fairly new to EATG and been on the board only 2 years. And as the chair of the board this last year, we receive a significant amount of emails from members directly asking us to make an opinion on a certain issue that's happening across Europe. It could be signing a document on behalf of the EATG, or it can be actually taking some decision on advancing a specific issue. And it's been incredibly difficult as 5 members to have the knowledge and expertise and skills to be able to respond to some of these one-off calls. And as Caroline says, it's not really the function of the board to be the key operational lead on certain issues. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, I'm saying this in a constructive way, in the sense of trying to look at clarifying how the executive director level can have people who support to enable the experts within the organisation to deliver on some of these calls. So, for example, if we are asked to, I know, Brian, you were used to doing high-level meetings at UN, or there could be calls for, we've had a number in the last few weeks where we've been asked to advise on some policy issues. Fine, if we've had experts within the EATG to deliver on and say, these are our opinion, this is what we should be lobbying for, this is what we should be fighting for. And Gus is very good at this within the PrEP and the preventative work programme. And how then we, as a board, just sign it off on behalf of the General Assembly in the terms of saying, the members have agreed to this, this is our governing role is to approve this and stamp the rubber stamp on something. Not actually get delivered in the operational management of delivering or putting together all the process. And I think Brian's highlight is where if we start to look at the structures beneath COOM and how COOM can manage effectively to deliver on the operational side of policies and be clear of what our board policies are, that we just rubber stamp things on behalf of the General Assembly, then it makes things much more clearer than how our role and functions are within each level. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand that David wants to say something because then he has to leave. So David, you take the floor.
Okay.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to comment on is the discussion around working groups. I think we are talking of a different stage here. What is now really important is to implement the new governance model and do that. The discussion about working groups is a second stage process that I would welcome very much, because the current working group model has been effective in the sense that output was related to face-to-face meetings, and that might no longer be the case. So what you need to think is not about the working group themselves, but what needs to be there in order to produce the requested or required output. And then you need to think about the structures you need to make that output possible. We should think about much more about what is the goal, what is the output, than about the working group and the structures first. We need to put the horse in front of the cart and not vice versa.
So when I talked about the 4 buckets of stuff that we would be covering in the next level document underneath documentation under the Constitution, what you were just saying there would fall largely under the bucket of purpose, and then at a governance level, so at a sort of a broad level, and then some of what else may be there for people around, not wanting EATG ever to operate without member involvement of a certain level or quality or whatever. That would fall more in the kind of in the risk boundaries type of bucket. So what I'm confident of, and I think I appreciate what was just said there, what I'm confident of is that we should be able to, at the level of governance documentation, we should be able to set a robust framework which allows sufficient freedom for the players to innovate, to be agile, to respond to what's needed, to try this if that doesn't work, and try that if this doesn't work, etc., etc. But that preserves those things that you all regard as key to the overall long-term success of EATG.
We're past our time now on this webinar. If there are any burning questions you haven't been able to ask, it would be great if you email them to Tamas and we'll try and respond. Or we are going to do a presentation, as I mentioned, at the General Assembly as well, and we will have all members of the steering committee there, so our steering group will be involved in this process to help with supporting that presentation. But if there is anything else in the meantime, please do contact either Tamas or Kuhn or myself, and we're happy to respond to anything. And thank you everybody for registering for today's webinar, and I hope that you've gained some insight into the hard and difficult process we've been going through.